Hello, everyone. Today I'm speaking with Walton Stanley, and Walton is on the board of the Minnesota Men's Conference. He's a storyteller and he has a long involvement in the theatre and the arts. So, welcome, Walton.
Thank you, John. Glad to be here.
Walton, we've spoken before, but we had talked about today speaking about Iron John, the story, 40 years on. Um, and perhaps reflecting on that story if we could. But I just wanted to start just before we get underway. Well, I think I don't know, maybe at 28, 29, came across a copy of Iron John, and like many people, I think it had a big impact. I was thinking this morning, there's that old saying that whoever speaks in myth speaks in 1,000 tons, I think it is, or whatever. But it's kind of like, the richness of it, and always the thing of that the young boy had to steal the key from his mother's pillow. Like it went in there, and it was such a rich book. But when we were speaking, earlier, prior, I was saying to you, one thing I've understood since then is I never really understood the structure of the story, though. And hopefully, a little later on, we could get to that a bit as well, because I think with, say, Joseph Campbell, there's separation, initiation, return. It's kind of, there's a beautiful simplicity in that he took from Van Gennep or whatever, and in terms of the mythological journey, whereas this story of Iron John has 8 parts to it, and it's a little more complicated in a way. So I'd like to, but maybe a little bit later on. But firstly, I wanted to ask you, 40 years on, that story, what did you like about it? What do you think about it after that span of time?
Yeah, it's really how I encountered this work, how I encountered Robert Bly and men's conferences. Initially, I was in a small group of men, and one of the men brought in an article from New Age magazine. It was before the book was written, but Robert was writing about the Iron John story, and he was in an interview, and he kind of told the story in that interview and expounded upon it. And then I went to hear him tell it, and then shortly after that, at that storytelling, he suggested that, well, let's do one of these conferences for men here in Minnesota. Passed the sheet around, and we all signed up, and that was the first conference in 1984. The conferences in particular had a huge impact on my life, and really reshaped how I was thinking about things, how I was thinking about the soul. I was in theater at the time, so I had a artistic sense, but the way Robert approached story and myth and the psyche and the soul, and approached it as maps of initiation, of a process of maturation, of tempering, was very different than anything I'd seen, and very engaging. And as you mentioned, the stealing of the key from under the mother's pillow, and which incidentally I think is interesting now, 40 years later, that Iron John
What you
knows where the key
you're
is.
still?
So,
I thought you were going to say you haven't stolen it yet, 40 years on, but no, sorry.
oh no, no, no. I think the key's well stolen in my case, but I find it interesting that he knows exactly where the key is, because the initiating male is connected with the deep feminine as well. So there's that interesting balance. He's not opposed to her. He just knows where the key is and where to get it. And it's the young man has to do that act.
Yeah.
But So that's an interesting moment. I think we were talking earlier about the moment where uh, obviously he goes off with Iron John into the woods, um, and that's a powerful moment of that separation from the family, from the birth family, and then the moment where the prince is asked to bring a bouquet of flowers to the princess, who's secretly seen his golden hair, and he chooses the wildflowers instead of the gardened flowers. Um, it's just a beautiful little touch of of bringing that beautiful kind of masculine wildness into the feminine part of the soul, wooing, in a sense, your own soul in that way.
Yeah, it is. It's a beautiful image. Well, I think there's just maybe a couple of things to go back for the people that aren't as aware of the book and the story and all of that. Is that it seems to me that if you look in the preface of Iron John, Robert Bly says this book is about masculine development or male initiation, but it's in no way intended to turn man against women or whatever. And the reason why I'm saying that is, well, two reasons. I think, perhaps in a more traditional sense, there was, well, I know in Australian Aboriginal culture, there's men's business, women's business, the two kinds of initiations, let's say, in traditional societies.
Right.
And
Right.
I think he was trying to get across that as much as there's the feminine women's business happening within the culture, that also there needs to be male development or whatever.
I think that's right, and I think especially at that time, so that was 1984 when I connected with Robert. At that time, women were doing a lot of work in this area. There were a lot of feminist scholars and thinkers that were engaging with the idea of the goddess, of the divine feminine, looking at older traditions, the Great Mother,
Yeah.
and all of that. So the feminists had done a great deal of work in that mythological realm.
Yeah.
Men were still, going to the football game and not paying attention to that, not paying attention to the soul in many ways, especially in America, which is a very utilitarian, success-driven, business-oriented society. Men weren't getting any
soul nourishment is one way of putting it.
Soul nourishment, yeah. Nor were they really doing the work to seek it out. And so I think that's why I think Iron John was written at the time it was. I think Robert sensed that lack, being a poet and being pretty connected to the soul in that way. I think he really saw that men were missing out on it.
It was very prescient in my book, and I think sometimes there was maybe a misperception in some quarters that of the I know I've said this before, but this is for people that are not so conversant with the book and the time of what was happening there. But there was maybe that image of men running around the forest bare-chested or whatever that was sometimes portrayed, but I think, as you're saying, that, he was going into that initiation and the old myths and the old knowledge.
He was, and we were, and it got mocked in the popular culture for sure. I mean, it caught on in the popular culture to some extent, but then the popular culture trivializes it and mocks it and makes fun of it and things like that. So, the
Caricatured.
Yeah, caricatured. So the running around the woods bare chested. Well, okay, there probably was some running around the woods bare-chested, but that's better than cutting down the woods for this quarter's profit too.
Yeah.
So uh, I would say, as I was mentioning to you before, it's an uninitiated, untempered masculine that is very dangerous. That's very misogynistic. That's very anti. That wants to escape the earth. It's afraid of death because part of initiation is, of course, coming to terms with mortality and with the feminine, with the Great Mother, and with being devoured, um, uh, and having a sense of groundedness, of having a sense of ancestry, and so not being in terror of that. Men who are in terror of that are men who are trying to actually destroy
Escape.
the earth, escape it.
Yeah. You know. Yeah. And one more thing I'd add is that in the beginning, stealing the key from under the mother's pillow, it's that someone said in both Freud and Jung, there was this idea of the need to move past both of the parents. So, and maybe we would say in Jung's language to set off on one's own way, one's own individuation journey. But I think sometimes when we talk about that, stealing the key from under mother's pillow, we're talking about, if you look at it through the puberty rites or through that time of youth, is that need to take that journey. And it also doesn't mean that you don't love your mother. It's just that love is transformed, let's say. It's that it's not a childish love. It's something where someone goes on a journey and the love remains. It's talking about some kind of separation, some kind of leap, some kind of journey that's taken.
Yeah, I think if you remain your mother's boy, the kind of perfect little angel boy she always wanted you to be, you're kind of never going to connect with your own soul and with your own destiny. It's a necessary separation. I mean, I think it's necessary for both genders in a way to separate from parents, but I think there's a different tone when it's the opposite sex. So I think you have to separate from that in a little bit different way. Um, and in order to become an adult, either an adult man or an adult woman, but to be an adult and to be a supporter of your own family, be in that role, become a parent, become a community member. You can't be that thing your parents necessarily think you should be, or you have to find your own way
Yeah.
to an extent.
And there's benefits for women in that, let's say. I mean, this is a shocking story, but I remember the story when I woke up this morning that I often used to go with my father, and my father ended up buying a farm in the country of Western Australia, but he began as a stock and station agent. He used to go and visit farmers, and he dealt with their livestock and all of that. And I often used to go with him when he did these. And I always remember going to a farm one day, and the husband and the wife were there. And I would have been 6 or 7. And the husband was calling his wife mum. And even as a little kid, I knew there was something shockingly wrong with all that. And sometimes I think he called her mother. But, when I thought about it later, and when I was thinking about it this morning, it's that sometimes what happens in those situations is that someone's with their family on the farm, and then they got married at 21 or 22 or something. And it was just kind of like transferred. Like there wasn't any initiation in between, so that the wife takes on the role of the mother or something like that. I mean, it's quite unbelievable, really.
Right. Yeah. And, I think we were seeing that phenomenon here of especially young men, a lot of young men aren't going to college. They can't afford it. They don't have the grades. They don't have the motivation. They don't have the attention span, whatever. And they're staying in their mother's basement and, asking her to cook their dinners when they're in their 30s and things. And it's really a kind of a wasted life. They haven't, they haven't been thrown out of the nest, if you will.
Out of the mother's realm. And these things
Yeah.
were so discreet in the indigenous world, like it was very discreet.
And that stealing the key, I remember years after Iron John was written, Martine Prechtel, who had been a shaman in a Mayan village, came and talked about Mayan initiation. And one of the things that that boys had to do in those initiations is they had to go steal, I think it was a cooking pot from their mother for the initiation. They had to steal it too. The mother wouldn't give it up, They had to be devious and steal it. And everybody knew it was going to happen, but it was an important part. The actual stealing of it was an important part of that initiation.
I remember in the book, of one thing that made me laugh is, I think one thing Robert Bly did really well was he had that understanding of the puer, the ascender, the flying boy,
the eternal boy, yeah.
And him asking that question about stealing the key, or opening that up to the audience, and someone saying, oh, we couldn't possibly steal the key. That isn't there. So, it's like that. What is it in a Jungian sense? It's like that kind of fateful move of embarking on one's own way. I think that it's taking that call to adventure or something. That's what it really means.
I think so, and it is, and it is breaking that boundary. He has to break something with the family, the nuclear family, in order to go off. He has to kind of commit some kind of violation.
It's a transgression.
Instinctually we see that. We see when boys are teenagers, they get real snippy with their mother and things like that, and there is that move to push it away, so it's instinctually there. It's just, as a culture, we don't have the ritual of doing it anymore.
And what about in the second part of the story, Walton, where so he's stolen the key from under his mother's pillow. He's released Iron John, the wild man, who I prefer to call the natural man sometimes, the natural man, Iron John. And they've gone into the forest. And then, getting back to how I was saying, maybe I didn't understand the structure of this story that well, because they go to a pond and his finger goes in the pond, it turns to gold. It's almost like you think, well, he's found the treasure there. But that's not quite what he was getting at, was it?
Right. He gains the treasure, but he doesn't have the capacity to hold it. He doesn't have a strong enough container, if you will, to put it in kind of alchemical terms. He doesn't have, the crucible's not strong enough to hold what's being put in there, right? So it isn't until he does the kind of 3 violations. He puts his finger in, and that's excused, and then a hair drops in, and then all his hair falls in and all turns gold, and he covers it up with his hat and things like that. And then Iron John says, well, that's enough. You have to go. You have to go out into the world now. But if you need me, just come to the edge of the forest and call. So he has to go with that gold hidden. And if he were to just go out at that point and say, here it is, it would just be eaten up. It would be like a young musical genius being eaten up by the music industry or something like that. The gold would be gone and dispersed and grabbed, right? So he is wise enough or lucky enough to have figured out that he needs to to keep it hidden at that point. So it's in there, gold's in there, and one could say, well, the gold's in there, like in Hillman's The Soul's Code. You know, the gift is there, right? The calling is there, but it isn't until it's processed and tempered and worked with that it's of use.
Maybe in our early life, there are some experiences or some openings, or that often happens, doesn't it? But they're not, as you say, contained. Might be a key word, that they're not really known, or they're not really the depth isn't understood, perhaps.
Yeah, interesting. At that first conference in 1984, one of the conference teachers or leaders was a man named Terry Dobson, who had brought Aikido to the United States. And he told just hanging around the dining hall, he told the story of how he got into Aikido, and there was a kind of very long and tortured process. But he ended up, he was in a doctor's office in Japan because of a cinder that was in his eye from a train. And he saw a scrap of newspaper in English announcing a demonstration of this new martial art called Aikido. And for whatever reason, he picked up, it was like under a chair. He just picked it up and he went to that demonstration. And what he said was, at seeing that demonstration, his first exposure to Aikido, he said, in some way, he understood it as deeply then as he did 40 years later as an Aikido master. Now, there was many hundreds of thousands of hours of being kicked in the head and thrown around on a mat before he achieved mastery of Aikido. But at some level, when he saw it, his soul was clear that that was it.
Yeah. In Hillman's language, that would be like the daimon announcing itself in one way or another,
Yeah. And in this case, a scrap of newspaper in English in the middle of Tokyo. Yeah.
Yeah. I find it with Robert Bly's book is, loosely, if you look from the first half of life to the second half of life and the initiation, puberty rites or whatever, towards that kind of second period of your life too. And when he starts to talk about, I don't know, which one is it? The third part of, or the third chapter in his book, which is also the third part of the initiation, really, the road of ashes, descent, and grief. So what can you tell us about that one? Because that reminds me of more the second, that kind of midlife or second initiation in a way.
It could, yeah, it certainly could be. It's a time of it's a time of reflection, of kind of interior work. It's a time of not necessarily paying attention to appearances. It's a time of kind of dirty hands-on work, if you will. There's a lot of stories in the European tradition have the Cinderella is the female version, but there's also the cinder biter is a male version. He eats the ashes. The ashkaladen is another name for it, the ash lad. Ashy paddle sometimes in certain stories, but they're often a young man or a young person who is kind of consigned to the ashes. Either they're literally living in the ashes, or they're sleeping behind the stove or something like that. They're almost always vastly underestimated by the society around them. They're considered, cast off. Yeah. But I think it's an important period to go through that ashes period, that slowing down. In a way, if you stay busy all the time, your soul may not ever kind of catch up with you, right?
Right.
So having that kind of ashes period, I once was in a performance piece, and and we were doing a number of poems from different poets around the world, and I was asked for the program to write a little biography, a paragraph on each poet, who they were, where they came from. And in doing the research, it was remarkable how many poets had a period in which they were given a little shack on the back 40 of somebody's land for a time where they didn't have to pay rent or didn't have to pay much. And they were, they just ended up in this little shack by themselves off in the back. And that gave them I think that was the ashes period for them, right? That's what enabled them to bring the poetry out, to let the soul catch up with the life, right? The life has to slow down,
Yeah.
so that the soul can catch up and really communicate. The daemon can speak, right?
Yeah, and Joseph Campbell had a similar thing, where he went to the house in the woods for, I can't remember how long. He said, I think something like 7 years or whatever, and just wrote and wrote. And there's kind of like that, what is it? The slow and patient work, which is not
Yeah.
that visible, maybe.
Right. And I think it's the same for a musician, all those hours in the practice room, and that could be ashes work.
Mm. And just going back to the previous chapter, when the hair turns gold, one thing I think the brilliance of Robert Bly, and he says somewhere in his book that he considered himself one of those flying ascenders as well, somewhere. And if you think of Robert Bly, the poet, and the love poetry, and and the
Absolutely.
romantic in a way, the
Yeah.
lover of Rumi and Hafiz and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then one of his genius insights or intuitive leaps, I think, was, I understood he was quite influenced by Marie Louise Lanfranc, and he took that thing of the puer, the ascender, the mama's boy, and then he saw it culturally as in operation in the New Age. And what I'm trying to say is, like going back to what we were just talking about, that road of ashes, ascent, grief, is kind of like what the youth or the flyer needs, is to kind of deepen and die a little from that kind of. But it doesn't always happen in the culture. Like if you go to Silicon Valley or whatever, you can be a flyer for your whole life, maybe.
Yeah. And if you're really lucky, you'll have your own spacecraft company and you'll ascend completely off the Earth and you'll go colonize Mars, right? That's the ultimate flying boy fantasy, right? Just leave the Earth entirely.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of spiritual flying boy, the one that takes in magnificent leaps of flights of fancy, if you will. That's an important part of the psyche. It's not to be dismissed,
No.
but it also needs to be kind of tempered and brought in. You can go too far in that direction, especially if you have nothing else to balance it out. And I think that's what Robert was seeing in the culture, both in kind of New Age men. I think there was even a song back in the day, "Sensitive New Age Guys." That was going around parodying that, but
it was big. It was big in our culture, wasn't it? In the 70s and the 80s, the spiritual group, the people going to India, the New Age culture.
Yeah, exactly. And nothing wrong with any of that, but there's also a balance, right? So unless you're going the other way too.
And it sometimes happens whether you like it or not. It's but as you say, that well, Hillman might call it the spirit, the spirit that loves the hide.
Yeah.
But okay, that might be a really necessary thing for us all, like for everyone. But often, perhaps as we go more towards the midlife, somewhere along the way, let's say, that there's that deepening, whether you like it or not. And that could be through illness, or it could be through, the loss of a job, or this or that, whatever, divorce. Or...
It can be. And, and Hillman, of course, had that essay, Peaks and Veils, right, which was all about the differences there. But it, to me, it's, it's as far as you go one way, and you can go the other. When you sever them, when you kind of cut down the world tree, if you will, then you fly off too high, or you can, conversely, you can go too low. You can go into the senex, the hardened, the hardened kind of, vicious, rule-bound Puritan, senex energy. So I think it is important to have both. It's important to have both in old age, to be able to take flights of fancy in old age is, I think, equally valuable, more valuable. But to ground that, to have that grounded in some kind of discipline where you can do something with it, I think is the goal. It's the idea of tempering, of balancing all those forces, right?
So when you talk about tempering, when you talk about initiation and the tempered male, I think I've heard you use that term before. What does the tempered male mean?
Well, to me, it's a little like it's kind of an alchemical image, or a metallurgical image, really. It's just that they're a person who, well, it has different meanings. One is that they keep their temper in a way. They don't essentially sort of fly off in useless rages, and things. They're not, they can handle things that come their way. They have a kind of an inner strength because of that tempering. I think in Iron John, there's a lot of actually metallurgical images. In fact, yeah. I was in a little chat with some friends, including Peter Hutter, who's on our board of the men's conference, and one of the things he mentioned was the idea of bog iron. So in the old days, people would actually source their iron in bogs, very much like Iron John, like bucketing out the pond would be what you would do to get iron. And it was rusty, right? It was very much like Iron John is described. And then it would be put through a tempering process, right, in order to make it into a tool, to make it into something of value for the community. In fact, I read a little blurb article somewhere that they found an old kind of Viking era forge in, I think, Denmark or somewhere in Scandinavia, and they were doing archaeological work, and they found they did some analysis on what they'd found, and what they found was charcoal made out of human bone. And what they think might have been happening is that people would take the literal bones of their ancestors, they would dig up, they would turn them to charcoal, just the way you turn, you heat it with not much air, and it's the carbon in the bone turns to charcoal. And then they would use that to make carbon steel. So your axe or your sword literally might be your grandfather in there.
Yeah.
So you were carrying that tool or that weapon. You were actually carrying the ancestral with you. So at any rate,
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking of when it comes to tempering. It's an image of initiation too. an alchemical tempering.
I
And
think
in the
I think I read in Michael Mead somewhere it was something like the metal of a man is like the metal of the sword. You know, is the it. But I think it's got to do with that. You know, we don't escape the breaking down and the the dying and the death and the you know
yeah,
it's it's
yeah.
it's that process is often where
And
the
the
kind of
heat, the energy, yeah, the heating and the cooling and the pounding and yeah.
yeah. Mm. Well, just maybe one more. The meeting with the god woman in the garden. What can you tell me about that?
Well, that's an image that obviously comes up a lot in fairy tales. You know, winning the princess, right? He is a prince. They are destined to be together. It's I think it's that kind of alchemical conjunctio, the masculine and feminine coming together in balance to create a new life, a new generation, a new, you know, they essentially save the kingdom, right? They regenerate it. So in order for, I think, a man to have a soul life, he has to be in touch with that feminine within himself, and he has to be able to attract that feminine, to attract that side of the soul, right, um, to him. So part of that is through things like the ashes work, and then like the which, by the way, is working in this story is working in a kitchen. So
Mm.
it's actually working with food, working with matter, working with sustenance, being able to feed something, right? So he's actually preparing her food at that point. So he's feeding that part of himself, and then
Mm.
he's wooing it with the flowers, and then eventually, you know, he wins it through, you know, through action, through kind of preserving the kingdom, defending the psychic kingdom, if you will. And it's only then that he has kind of earned the right to sort of be with her. He's shown he has the metal, the tempering, to be with her.
Mm.
Uh,
It's like the male and the female are the two great symbols of the opposites, aren't they? It's kind of like the conjunctio is the what can be driven apart in enmity can also be brought together through love. Um, uh,
yeah, and it has to be brought together to sustain life, to continue life, right? So, I mean, biologically, but also I think psychically, those things have to be brought into balance and into relationship
mm.
within the psyche in order for it to thrive and to flower.
I remember Hillman saying once that what I got from it is that in the second half of life, that often the initiation for men comes through the feminine. That perhaps in the first half, you know, and as we're talking about Iron John, that there's the masculine development, the boy goes and hangs out with the man, they tell him some of the first stories and, you know, myths and all of
Yeah.
that. And there's those acts of courage and da 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 da. But it's the second half of life is he said it's like that would in Jung's terms that would be called the initiation through the feminine would almost be the way of individuation itself, you know, that
I think that's right. And I think, you know, like I was saying earlier, that Iron John has a connection to the feminine. He knows where the key is, you know. Well, how does he know it? Well, he's connected with it. So the initiating male, and Iron John isn't, you know, he, like I said, he comes back as a shining golden king at the end. The enchantment is broken. They can see him in his true form, not as the hairy man, right? Um, I think you see that with elders in communities where, you know, the younger people, it's very important, men's business, women's business, and all that. You get to a certain age, the old men and the old women are, off on the side, telling dirty jokes to each other. They're not, all of that, kind of Sturm and Drang around, around sex and around, the mating and around all of that, and the feminine, the masculine, I think a lot of that just kind of cools out, and the old guys know they're going to die. They're not afraid of old women. They're not afraid of the great mother or the image of the great mother, the image of the crone.
Yeah.
They're now connected, because of that lifelong tempering process. But
and we miss out on so much if we just rely on them. Like I often think there's an old school of masculine heroics. Like sometimes when people talk about heroics, they talk about it in that old cultural sense. But if someone goes too far in that, they can become very one-sided. I don't know, what would be the cliche? Working in the business 12 hours a day, making a lot of money, but
well, I mean, yeah, I mean, all of our popular culture, the movies, Star Wars and things like that, are really mostly about young people becoming heroes, standing up and fighting for the right. But I was mentioning this to someone the other day that when you look at European stories, including Iron John, they tend to end with the prince and the princess get married and they live happily ever after, right? That's the classic ending, So we get to that point, but they're still young, for the most part. And things tend to happen in threes. There's leaving on the adventure, there's the slaying of the dragon, and there's coming together and the big wedding at the end. I've been noticing that in like Native American stories and some other stories from in non-Western cultures, indigenous cultures, the stories tend to happen in fours. And you have this kind of the same three movements. There's the kind of classic Joseph Campbell call to adventure kind of thing, whatever it is, and they go through the trial and the horrible times, and they win the power. But in a number of these stories that I've seen, there comes a time where they say they win the medicine, the heart of the dragon that gives them great powers and all that, and then they say, you know what, let's give it back. Let's, it gets reconstituted, it gets put back into the earth, gets put back into the water, whatever it is. The cycle continues. They don't try to grab on to the energy. They learn what they learn. They take the medicine, they use it, and then they put it back,
giving back to the earth.
Yeah, and that's a piece that I don't see in the European fairy tales very often.
Right. I think there's a couple of things from that. Is first off, to be one-sided. I don't know. In my language, is if you start to think more in terms of the soul, perhaps, that the archetypal feminine and the archetypal, regardless of gender, are available, and that it's the one-sidedness which is crippling or wounding in a way. Well, I think that's what Jung said is a neurosis, one-sidedness. Whereas the double side comes, and whether you're a man or a woman, of course, the archetypal masculine is available to the woman, archetypally these things are available, and therefore it's more of a rounding.
And nurturing and beauty and care of beautiful, delicate things are available to people in male bodies as well. Yeah.
And sometimes in traditional cultures, like I was watching, I don't know whether you've seen it, but there's Stanley Tucci in Italy and Eva Longoria in Mexico. And I can't remember whether it was the Mayan or the Aztec, but that tradition of the kind of men, women.
Hmm.
Oh well, in the part that she was in, it's men that have always had that role of actually cooking for the tribe. So they're men dressed as women who cook for. But I think psychically, if that's where we're heading, is that maybe some ability to take on from the opposite side, some of the qualities is something that we're talking about.
Well, I think it's important, and it's not necessarily that you have to identify with it, and
Yeah,
maybe there's a lot of, that is true for some people. They are identified that way,
yeah.
and that's the way it is. That's always been the case. But I don't think you necessarily have to identify, as the opposite gender in order to access the energy of the feminine, or the energy of the
Well,
masculine.
that's what the archetypal understanding would be. If one
Yeah,
understands archetypes, then one can. There's a psychic availability. It's not just a
yeah,
physical thing necessarily, although it could be. It
right.
could be for some people. There's traditions
Yeah,
that way
yeah, right,
as well.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know we're getting close to the time, Walton, but I just wanted to. I know when we spoke last time, I just wondered whether we could touch on a couple of things. Finally, maybe your conference that's coming up, but Hillman and Bly strike me as we'd spoken about this before. Strike me as two different people, but why Hillman, Bly, me working together seemed very different, Hillman and Bly. So why did they hit it off, or what was happening there, or from your
I think, yeah, I think it had to do with Hillman's perception that psychically that the culture was anesthetized, was disconnected from aesthetics, from art, from beauty, from and of course Robert was all about aesthetics, whether it be poetry or song or the arts or storytelling and things. And of course, myth is also approaching myth in that way, talking about story in that way, sharing the story, and really going into it, putting yourself in the story is an aesthetic act, right? And that's something that no one was doing back, other than Robert was really doing back in 1984. A number of people are doing it now, and I'm happy to see that. But I think that's what drew James to that work. I think I was mentioning, he always maintained kind of his own look and aesthetic. I think he enjoyed hanging out with the guys, if you will. But he always wore a tie, or often wore a tie and a jacket at a men's conference, and he would be the only one doing that. Um, but he would also, put on his old sailor hat and his tap shoes and do a tap number for us as well. So I think he enjoyed I think he appreciated working with the aesthetic, and men especially turning toward that and trying to become de-anesthetized, trying to wake up the soul. I think that was very much in line with what Hillman was trying to do in psychology. So they might have seemed like odd bedfellows, but they were close friends, and they really worked beautifully together. It was beautiful to watch, Robert Bly and Michael Mead and James Hillman, kind of riff and go back and forth and argue about a story or an image, or take things apart to witness those minds kind of going through that, and to challenging each other, and
saying
playing.
what I was saying to you earlier, when those three got together and made the Rag and Bone Shop of the Heart,
Yeah,
they
great
they came up with some
poetry.
beautiful poetry. And Robert Bly, I get James Hillman as this person who's a classical scholar, spoke at Erenos, and
Yeah.
did the lectures at Yale and the Terry lectures and all of that. But for
Yeah.
him, it's like a bit of coming down to the earth, because some people see his time with the men, it was a bit of an aberration, but I see it as him. And then, as you say, like he wanted to take psychology out of the consulting room and bring it to the street and that
Yeah.
transformative environment. But then
And
sorry.
I remember him saying that, he saw more movement in individuals at those conferences, sometimes in 6 days, than he would see in a decade in the consulting room.
Yeah.
So it was, I think, very much that, taking psychology into the streets, or into the woods in this case. But he also, he shared those lectures, or in some cases, I think he took the lectures he gave for us and then brought them out. But a lot of those lectures and essays and things like that are things that that I heard him present at men's conferences. So
Yeah.
it wasn't that he was doing something, I think, radically different for him. He
Yeah.
was just taking his work, and he found a fertile ground to plant that in.
And Robert Bly was just so before his time that I think I read somewhere that he encouraged Coleman Barks to, was part of that process of translating Rumi. And then who has done more than Robert Bly than introduce Rumi and Hafiz and
Well,
good poetry into the US and further, really?
that's right. I mean, he really brought Pablo Neruda to consciousness in the U.S., and Thomas Trunstormer, and and many other in translation. Yeah, and as you said, he's also the one that handed a sheaf of Rumi poems to Coleman Barks and said, let these things out of their cages,
Mm.
um, which started that. And when I think I met Robert Bly in 1984, I think the most read poet in America was Rod McEwen. I've looked at clouds from both sides now. And by the mid 90s, the most read poet in America was Rumi.
Mm.
So yeah, Robert Bly was a absolute giant in the poetry field.
Yeah.
No question.
Yeah.
Yeah. And his own poems are also brilliant as well, but
Yeah.
just having that deep knowledge of poetry and that deep
Mm.
connection to the
It's
poet.
it's a good book, Rag and Bone, Chop of the Heart, because it's
One of
got
the
good.
very best anthologies of poetry. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
So, yeah.
And just finally, Walton, I wonder whether you can tell me about what's happening in October, the conference, isn't it? So it's 40 years and
Yeah, so 1984 was the very first conference, and Iron John was a story that was brought into that conference. And so this year in Minnesota, well, actually just across the border in Wisconsin, but in the
oh
Twin
no,
Cities area.
is that going to create a problem at all?
No, we're fine. We October 1st through 6th, we are having the 40th anniversary Minnesota Men's Conference. We will be telling Iron John. We'll also be welcoming an author, a scholar and thinker by the name of Robert Bringhurst. If you don't know Robert Bringhurst's work, he has a beautiful book called The Tree of Meaning. He probably knows more about myth and story and the oral tradition. He brought basically was teaching literature in Canada, and it occurred to him that how could he teach the literature of Canada if he was only teaching works in English and French? And so he learned the Haida language and worked with Cree people, and he brought a vast number of indigenous stories out, working directly with those communities, and writes beautifully about how myth and how story functions, and it's meant to function in society. So we're really excited to have Robert Bringhurst join us this year.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Walt, and thanks for speaking
Yeah,
once
thank you,
again.
John. Yeah, lovely to talk to you.
See you later.